In this video, I will be giving you feedback on the source discussion from week 3. This is the one from Beverly about the differences and similarities between servants and slaves in Virginia. It's important to get this distinction right because you sometimes hear that people complain that white people's ancestors were also slaves. You occasionally see things on the internet claiming that the Irish were slaves, for example. And it's important to understand that although life was hard for both servants and slaves, white servants were not kept in a situation of slavery. And this source does quite a good job of explaining similarities and differences between the two. By servants in this context, we mean indentured servants, that is, people who had legally agreed to serve for a certain number of years in return for an employer paying for their passage across the Atlantic. They were there voluntarily, even though they were unfree and were not having a particularly great life, whereas the slaves were, of course, there against their will. So the differences, I'll take it that way around. That's the order in which I ask the questions. The differences were that slaves were black and servants were white. Beverly makes it clear that slaves who were the children of slave mothers inherited their slave status. So there's a racial divide between the two, and slavery is something that you are born into, you can't get out of very easily. Other differences, servants serve for only a limited period, often 7 years in the examples that Beverly uses. It is 5 years or until the age of 24 for young people, whereas slaves serve for life, of course. There's differences between the employment of women, whereas male servants and slaves both worked in the fields. Only female slaves worked in the field. White women were not worked in the field. They did domestic work. Now, for the similarities, as we've seen, the slaves and the servants, at least among the men, did the same work. Beverly claims that the slaves were no worse treated than the male servants were. The way in which Beverly defends these practices, people in England are complaining about the Virginians cruelly treating their slaves and their servants. He defends them firstly by saying that life was no worse for servants and slaves in Virginia than it was for the average worker in agriculture in England, what he refers to as the common freeman, the person who is neither a low-ranking indentured servant nor a wealthy landowner. Husbandmen, by which he means basically farmers, and day labourers, people who work for wages, what today we would call the working class. And he claims that life is no worse and the labour conditions are no worse in Virginia than they were in England. He cites, for example, the fact that there are limited hours in the day. Nobody is expected to work any longer than their overseer who is in charge of them. And he then argues, and he spells it out in some detail, you don't need to go into all the detail, but he then argues that there are laws in place protecting these people, lists a number of legal provisions in Virginia's law code giving protection to servants and to slaves.